The roadmap process is from Chapter 5 of the book Roadmaps to World Class, which I wrote, Stephen Starling. The roadmap process is selected by organizations to create an enterprise roadmap using the results from the SCORE process. Now, after the SCORE process, the results from that particular process could have gone into the audit process, and then the official SCORE report could have been generated, which would be the better information in terms of data to come into the roadmap process because bias would be reduced. The enterprise refers to divisions and/or business units, and I have to state that because I've been in so many companies and organizations where enterprise is being defined as their supply chain. But according to the most current definitions that I have found out there in literature is that enterprise is indeed referring to internal business units and divisions. The roadmap process is designed for multiple organizations, not for a single organization. So in roadmap, you would have internal business units essentially coming together. You wouldn't take one business unit and go through the roadmap process because you're not comparing your data and your information from the SCORE report against anybody else to discover opportunities between two different organizations. The roadmap process essentially has 7 different phases. The first phase is review. The second phase is opportunity. And to be frank, about 60% of the time at least will be spent in the opportunity phase. There definitely is a weighting towards that particular phase. The third phase is called agree. The fourth phase is develop. M for milestone, A for authorize, and P for proceed. Now, part of why we keep using acronyms for these processes, and I haven't really mentioned this before, but it's just simple the fact that when you're talking and having dialogue with people within industry and you're bringing up what it is you're working on or working towards, these acronyms make it easy to remember the processes involved. So in the case of the drive processes, there are 29 different phases. And for example, in my case, I can actually say all 29 phases in a sit-down conversation with somebody, say on an airplane, relatively easily because the acronyms help to cue me. The goal of most organizations engaging in the roadmap process is to extend their organization's current efficient frontier to the enterprise frontier. And you can see on the right a figure that has been presented in the Chapter 1 presentation, and then I've been carrying this idea of the efficient frontier expansion from presentation to presentation. We can identify very quickly where the optimal portfolio is given a 20,000 hour budget, which is consistent with the examples in the previous presentations. The methodology presented in the roadmap process is similar to that in the established project portfolio process and project portfolio management, PPM. I actually prefer to use the term PPM over PPP, but we're getting into acronym soup as usual here. With respect to PPM, there are essentially generic steps that are usually taken by organizations. And I compiled this list from quite a few different books and so forth to consolidate into one. Essentially, first, establish a project council. Then second, identify project categories and criteria. 3, organizations are encouraged to collect project data. Then 4, they're encouraged to assess the resources based upon these projects perhaps being executed or not. Then a big point associated with PPP and PPM is the idea of reduction of the project and criteria set. Then from this, we want to prioritize the projects within categories, select the projects to be funded, and then implement the process. This all sounds very straightforward. There are some limitations in terms of the literature on PPP and PPM. Now, clearly, what we've been talking about thus far within the Roadmaps to World Class book that I've written is trying to develop and expand our efficient frontier out to our enterprise and out to alliances. I tend to find that the PPP and PPM literature on doing this is very scant at best. In fact, in the discussions of establishing, for example, a project council, there really isn't much literature out there on this council being multi-companies coming together, such as we've called for in the development of a Roadmaps Development Council. And then also when it comes to things like, for example, reducing the project and criteria set, the literature, I believe, on PPM tends to want to limit what it is that the companies and organizations are looking at for their projects. We, on the other hand, are actually trying to expand and brainstorm our thinking to including possible projects that could be far, far into the future, which is this concept of robust horizon management. So the selection of projects to be funded, for example, too, is a little different in the way that we approach it within the roadmap process and throughout the book, essentially, Roadmaps to World Class, because what we're looking at in terms of projects to be funded is comparing our own internal projects against those across our alliances, even as far as the alliance frontier. So there are some serious differences between traditional PPM and PPP in terms of what is written out there and what we are talking about when it comes to robust horizon management and the development of robust roadmaps in extending to the robust frontier. One of the biggest problems that I run into when we're talking about having projects that go across different organizations within the same enterprise, and certainly across companies that are working together in alliances or in chains, is this idea of information sharing. The reason why there's a problem with it is because companies generally don't like to share information with other organizations. So in helping us come to a resolution of this particular problem, in the roadmap process, organizations will develop what we call collaborative project opportunities. Now, with respect to collaborative project opportunities, you're going to have the choice as leading your organization as to what information the other companies, or in the case of the roadmap process, what other divisions get to see your results on the specific attributes, this meaning the attribute scores. Because perhaps you don't want the other divisions to know you scored poorly on a given attribute, or that you have, I think successes you'd want to share, but certainly where you did poorly. So you're going to have to decide whether, if you have a gap that you want to try to fix, and you've got an opportunity within your enterprise to get help on that, whether you engage in that or not. So what we want to do is we want to transform these collaborative project opportunities, or CPOs, into actual collaborative projects. But to do this, once again, an organization must share the information. So if information is not protected, then it's my belief, based upon interactions with companies and certainly anybody dealing with the government, that collaboration efforts may ultimately lead to a rethinking of the strategy of collaboration. So a company that might be relatively proactive thinking today, once they discover that if they want to actually develop these alliances and they have to share information to do so, they may renege essentially on this idea of developing alliances and having boundaryless collaboration. I've seen it specifically in the defense and aerospace industry. So the roadmap process is built in every precaution possible to enable organizations to share the minimum amount of information on attributes and their derivative projects. But once again, as I pointed out, you can't avoid this completely. Suppose 5 divisions develop an enterprise roadmap together, and we look at collaborative project opportunities and then those that are not collaborative projects. Now, I haven't mentioned what a not collaborative project is. We couldn't come up with anything fancier to say as terms of to compare between a collaborative project and one that isn't, so NCP is what stuck. In terms of that, a not collaborative project is where you are doing the roadmap process and the robust process, and you're identifying which attributes you want to turn to projects for collaboration, but there are going to be many different projects you're going to say, oh, wait a minute, we can improve this ourselves. We just weren't aware that it was needed as an improvement, or that maybe there was an idea that we developed out of SCORE that we can now turn into a project for our own internal people to be able to handle. So we do want to be able to have the opportunity for you to classify your projects as being not collaborative in addition to collaborative project opportunities, because the not collaborative projects are still opportunities for your organization. But what I want to do right here is I want to take a look at and see kind of what we're looking at when we have, say, 5 divisions and they want to develop an enterprise roadmap together. Suppose that Division A has 100 not collaborative projects and 60 collaborative projects. Similarly, Division B might have 150 non-collaborative projects and 10 collaborative project opportunities. So let's continue this with C, D, and E. Now, when we start to combine this together and we start to look at, okay, if we want to develop a roadmap and we combine all these collaborative projects together, we could end up with, say, in the case of this example, your collaborative roadmap having 255 collaborative project opportunities. So you would have, in the case of, say, Division E, where they've got 300 NCP projects, there are more projects going on outside of the collaborative space than there are internally within it. And in fact, when I bring up the idea of roadmap projects themselves, the 255, they're the CPO projects in the center. Now, Division E, with 300 projects that are not collaborative and 45 that are collaborative, they only have a percentage of 45 divided by 255 that they're even engaged in within the collaborative roadmap. Okay, when we're talking about protecting proprietary information, one of the problems that we've had in terms of working with companies to develop collaborative roadmaps based upon projects is the fact that in the collaborative space we do have these different projects, and in many cases they link back to projects in one way or another at the different divisions. In this case, we could consider the same example for companies that are working together in an alliance. It's the same idea. So in, say, my Division A, we might have a couple of not collaborative projects, ones that we do not want the other divisions to see and that we really should not be sharing, that are maybe immediate predecessors to the collaborative project 2. Now, if they're immediate predecessors to collaborative project 2 and we can't show any information within the collaborative workspace with regard to these 2 projects, what we can do in most cases is put in what we call a placeholder milestone. And the placeholder milestone just simply records the expectations in terms of the duration and the date that essentially the predecessors will be completed, such that the collaborative project 2 can start on time. So the actual duration in a placeholder milestone, by the way, would be 0 essentially. It serves like a dummy activity if you're familiar with project management theory. Now downstream we also have not collaborative projects, but in the case of these we don't really need a placeholder milestone because the information of the collaborative project 2 in this case is in the public domain of the enterprise at least. In the same way, we've got not collaborative projects down for Division B and Division C. Up to this point, we have not even started with the different phases of the roadmap process itself. But in the review phase, opportunities are generated by comparing capabilities and project priorities for the attributes. Now, where did these capabilities in terms of the data to be able to make these comparisons and project priorities, where did they come from? Well, they came from essentially the SCORE report for each of the different organizations. And the SCORE report could have come from either the SCORE process or the audit process. Came from the audit process if the organizations involved were registered with the Roadmaps Institute to remove the bias of the different scores. If the audit process was bypassed, the data would have come straight from the score process in the form of an unofficial score report. The comparisons then between the different capabilities and project priorities of the organizations are summarized and ranked by an opportunity index. Essentially, the higher the index, the better the opportunity for a beneficial collaboration, based at least on this preliminary data. So this gives us a way of sorting through the weeds to find these different opportunities that we want to focus our management attention on. The abbreviation, by the way, for opportunity index is OI. Now, with respect to this, we can see here that attribute XPO, and actually there's a tie for 4 of the top attributes here with the highest opportunity index, at least within this list, of 120 points. So let's look at the opportunity index and go over how it's calculated very briefly here. Suppose the data on the right is for 10 attributes on which 5 organizations have scored themselves. So we can see here we've got attribute A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K as designated by the first column. In the second column, we can see for our division, let's assume our division is division C, we can see the scores for the attribute scores for all these different attributes. So on attribute A, we've identified this as a burning platform, highest level project priority. This is something we need to get done in the next 2 years. Similarly, under my division C, B is a capability that we feel that we are very good at, that we are 100% in terms of our usage of this within our particular systems. Now, the thing you notice about A and B, which is not coincidence because this is an example and I tried to actually pattern it this way, is under A, we can see that we have a project priority that is very high for attribute A, and all the other divisions have 100% capability in what it is we're trying to achieve. So we'll be able to get help from either division A, B, D, or E, we hope at least, as long as they agree to helping us. We should be able to get help from these different divisions to be able to improve what it is we deem as a burning platform attribute that should turn into projects. Now, attribute B, if you take a look at it, it's a capability that we have that we could be sharing with the other divisions because all of them have it as a burning platform, red 5, essentially. So, green cells are where an organization scored itself with full capability regarding that attribute. The yellow cells are once again, as we identified in the score process, where you have partial capabilities regarding the attributes. In other words, 20, 40, 60, or 80%. The red cells are where an organization scored the attribute as the highest priority to implement in the next 2 years, and that only leaves us with one other color, other than irrelevant, which was black from the score process, but the non-irrelevant values being blue cells where the plan is to implement the attribute after 2 years or more. With respect to the opportunity index, some observations are in order. First, there is no such thing as no opportunity between 2 different organizations. Hence, the adjusted index is always positive. Now, we consider different situations and scenarios in coming up with this conclusion. Suppose you have 2 companies, or 2 organizations in this case within the same enterprise, and both have a burning platform project that they want to try to achieve. Well, certainly there's the opportunity for 2 companies with red 5s to collaborate together to pool their resources to reduce essentially their costs, or maybe to be able to go down the learning curve much faster to achieve the project. The converse is true if you have 2 organizations that have greens and both have all the capability they feel that they need. They could be still getting together and discussing different ways that they could even improve beyond the existing 100% capability. That's not completely inconceivable that a new paradigm break could occur from that type of dialogue. There's more likelihood for a opportunity though when you got 2 red 5s certainly coming together. Now, opportunities break into essentially improvement opportunities and leadership opportunities. And the clearest examples of these are the first two rows of data in the figure to the right for attribute A and attribute B. Improvement opportunities are where my division has a red or blue indicating they can improve. So this exists for attribute A in the figure to the right, where my division C has a burning platform issue, or attribute rather, that can be turned into projects that is a red 5, whereas all the other divisions within the enterprise state that they have that capability, essentially with 100% availability, such that perhaps we could tap into what it is these other divisions are doing and get help from them to improve and be able to execute our project. The converse is true for the second row of data in the figure. That refers to the idea of leadership opportunities, or where my division has a green or yellow indicating that they can help others. Now, in the case of the my division C for attribute B, we have a green, which means that we should be able to help out the other divisions, which in the row for attribute B, you can see that all the other divisions have the attribute as a burning platform project for them. So let's look at calculating the opportunity index. To calculate the opportunity index, we needed to adjust the attribute scores to a single scale from -5 to +5. If you recall, the project priority and the capability for a given attribute were two different values in the score process. Now we want to combine them together into essentially one scale, from -5 to +5. The way we do this is by essentially taking and incorporating both of them together by multiplying all of the project priorities by -1. So we can see that here with the +5 in the table to the left, that becomes a -5 in the adjusted attribute scores in the table to the right. We can continue down this column and see that in every case we've done this multiplication times -1. I could continue and show you for every cell where there is a red or a blue that essentially this has occurred. Let's consider for the moment how it is you would calculate the opportunity index. Let's go column by column in this example, and first let's start with the far left column, attribute, and simply this column states what the attribute actually is in terms of the title of it. We went with simplicity here, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K. The second column is my company, and this is the value from the adjusted table of the attribute scores to put all the attributes onto one scale from -5 to +5. The next column is the most complicated one probably to figure out, and that's the highest division contrast. And essentially there are two if-then rules based upon the cell for my division or my company being a positive or a negative. If the value for division C is a negative, and here's an example of a negative value in the third row, then the maximum value of the attribute scores in the same row for the other divisions is selected. So our choices here are between 5, 2, -5, and -2. So which one of these would you select? Well, if you selected 5, which is the highest value in terms of the certainly positive, that was the number that you need to select. So this 5 then is dropped straight into the highest division contrast column, and then we'll be able to use it to calculate the next column. Let's look at one more example here, though, because you could have a value for division C being positive. And if it's positive, then the minimum value of the attribute scores in the same row for the other divisions is selected. So if we take, say, the fifth row here of attributes, we have a +5 for my division. What would you choose for the rest of the attribute values on this particular row in terms of the minimum value? Well, the minimum value would be -4, and we can transfer this number directly into our table below for the highest division contrast. The fourth column we want to look at is the absolute value of the difference. And this is simply, if we look at attribute A, we have a -5 for my company and then a +5 for the highest division contrast. The -5 becomes a +5 when the absolute value is taken. So we've got 5 plus 5 is equal to 10. Similarly for column B, we have a +5 for my company and a -5 for the highest division contrast. The -5 for highest division contrast, when you take the absolute value, becomes a +5. So 5 plus 5 gives you 10. And we just carry this calculation all the way down to the bottom. The fifth column is the baseline opportunity index, and that simply is multiplying the absolute value of the difference times 10. So we get a value up to 100 in this case. In the next column, we have the sum of the absolute values of the division scores. And this is a adjustment of the baseline opportunity index to account for the increased probability of having a successful collaboration when more organizations are involved in the roadmap process. So essentially, this is the opportunity index gives us essentially a adjustment by taking some values within for all the different values associated with the different divisions in this case, and then summing those up in terms of their absolute values. So if we look at this example here, we have 3 and a -5, a -3 and a 5. What we're going to add together then is the absolute value of each of these. So it'd be 3 plus 5 plus 3 plus 5 gives us 16, as shown in the table. These calculations then are allowing us to calculate an opportunity index, which is simply the sum of the baseline opportunity index plus the sum of the absolute values of the division scores. So in the first row for attribute A, we would see 100 plus 20 gives us an opportunity index of 120 for attribute A. For attribute B, we have 120 also. If we jump all the way down to the bottom for the row associated with attribute K, we can see that we had a 0 baseline opportunity index, but based upon this idea that there's always going to be some sort of opportunity between the organizations in one way or another, our minimal score here of essentially 20 is added to the 0 to give us an opportunity index of 20. So now that we've calculated our opportunity index, we want to decide which attributes we want to take to a discussion or a meeting that could be held online or in an actual meeting room to discuss the opportunities for collaboration based upon these attributes. With respect to this, the table below shows you one way that we can go about identifying how or whether we want to have these particular meetings. By putting an X mark in the CPO, the very first column, the collaborative project opportunity column means that your attribute score will be viewed by other divisions or business units. The other divisions are also going to be deciding whether they want to collaborate by putting an X within their view. So the view down at the bottom is just for Division C. All the other divisions will have their own view, which will be similar, but in the case of where you see the scores for C, if you're Division A, for example, you would see your scores there, and then C would be in with the group with the other divisions. So let's look at just one row here. In the first row, we can see that Division C wishes to collaborate, and they've done this by checking the box or putting an X in the box for CPO. And Divisions A and B have signaled that they are willing to assist Division C. How do we know this? Well, A and D have indeed identified that they, with a green signal, that essentially that they would like to collaborate with Division C. Now, what they had to do in their views, of course, was check the CPO box, but they probably didn't do that until they saw that C was asking for by clicking on the CPO box for assistance. Okay, so in continuing with the opportunity phase, attributes selected by checking the CPO or NCP boxes in the review phase become discussions in the opportunity phase. Now, you might be saying, wait a minute, what about these NCP boxes? Why would they actually go on to discussion? Because these are not collaborative projects. Well, one of the wonderful things about investigating the options for collaboration, we will dig a little bit deeper into what it is that we need as an organization within, say, the greater enterprise, and might actually discover that there are potential projects that we would consider for collaboration, but then after a little bit of thought decide, well, we have the ability to develop this capability ourselves. So one of the outcomes of the roadmap process is that you will also have non-collaborative or not collaborative projects that will go into your own proprietary roadmap for your organization. So these discussions that take place could be in an online format, such as forums in a discussion board, and these would need very little facilitation. In contrast, the meetings could take place in traditional format meeting rooms, such that you'd have to fly people from one location to another, or a tremendous amount of traveling might have to take place. I suppose also you could have the meetings being teleconference, and that would probably work also if you did not use an online format. Now the opportunities can be re-ranked by a new index called a collaborative opportunity index, particularly if you've had quite a few of these potential projects that there was a lot of agreement in terms of collaboration wanting to be done between the different divisions. So, for example, suppose 3 companies have individual opportunity indices of 120, 114, and 86. This new index, called the Collaborative Opportunity Index, or the COI, would therefore be 120 plus 114 plus 86, or 320 points. Now, this is a pretty simple approach in terms of calculating this Collaborative Opportunity Index. What it obviously weights is if you have more organizations or more divisions interested in collaborating, the score is going to be higher and will go up to the top. Here is a snapshot of an online discussion forum for a, in this case, supplier scorecards potential project between several organizations within an enterprise. The first thing you can probably notice here is the Collaborative Opportunity Index is 733. The negative in front of the 733 is actually showing that the thread is expanded, not that that's a negative value. The discussion is broken down into set topics, and these are standard categories. In this case, you can see discovery, breakdown, leadership, value, dependencies, placeholder. These are all categories of a discussion for a given opportunity between the organizations. These predefined topics provide structure and information needed to downstream develop the project charters for the next phase coming up after opportunity, which is agree. Okay, so now we're actually in a discussion associated with the different attributes where we have the opportunities. And this is a very important part of the opportunity phase. This is probably where the bulk of the work in the roadmap process occurs. The first stage, I guess you could call it, with these discussions is discovery. And this is where we actually look and see, okay, you have a red 5, we have a green 5, but will our solution that we have within our division actually work for yours? Simple fundamental questions. And in fact, this may be the end of the discussion if there isn't a match. But then we move to breakdown, and that's where we look at the different projects that would be required to have that capability developed within the given companies or organizations rather, which are desiring to have the capability developed. Now in breakdown, we might end up having an attribute breakdown into 1 project, 2, 3, heck, it might be 60 different projects if that opportunity is a huge opportunity and has a lot of needs associated with it. Then we need to establish leadership of the various projects which are developed through breakdown. We need to calculate the value of the various projects. This needs to be done by each organization that would be involved with each project. Each organization needs to understand the value to them, and this is where a little bit of negotiation is going to start to take place because this is where some organizations might back out if there isn't a value for them in being in that project. We also want to calculate the hours in terms of the management hours we believe are going to be needed to fulfill the project, and this information should have been incorporated into the value calculation. We also want to identify the dependencies. Are the projects we're developing, do they interconnect within themselves essentially, but do they also interconnect perhaps, and are they dependent upon, or are they immediate predecessors of projects outside of this particular discussion? We also want to establish if placeholders are necessary, which a placeholder might be necessary if a proprietary project has to occur at one of the divisions before the project, which is the collaborative projects which we're developing within the discussion, can take place. And finally, we want to develop a charter, and this charter for each project would then go on to the next phase, which would be the agree phase. But before we reach the agree phase, we need to discuss some of the issues here within this opportunity discussion, because there are quite a few here, in particular the calculation of the value, which I need to show you essentially a project value index calculation and how that value might be calculated. First, let's take a look at project setup. A project proposal may be set up at any time during a discussion. And in fact, in breakdown is where that would occur, usually at least, and you might have multiple projects within breakdown being set up. By default, whoever sets up the project proposal is the project lead manager, but then you can change that in the leadership stage of the discussion. Essentially, the project proposal is a charter that contains summaries of the information provided in the 8-point list in the previous slide of the discussion. Setup of a project proposal does not mean the project has been accepted or authorized. It just means a proposal has been developed. So let's look at some project selection criteria. Project selection is the process of evaluating individual projects or groups of projects and then choosing to implement some of them to achieve the organization's objectives. Now, each organization will have its own objectives, and certainly the enterprise as a whole would have objectives too. So each organization within the enterprise has got to balance its own objectives against the enterprise's. The project return for each individual project is calculated in this phase and focuses on both non-financial and financial results of the projects. So first, let's consider the easy part, which is the qualitative project selection. Is the project, for example, a sacred cow, where the project is suggested by a senior or powerful official in the organization? Well, it tends to be that sacred cows tend to occur and get added to the project portfolio. Is it due to an operating necessity? Is the project required in order to keep the system operating? So sacred cows and operating necessity projects tend to go in before we really start adding projects based upon return. Unfortunately, this will minimize, or I guess you could say suboptimize, your project portfolio and put you below the efficient frontier. Is the project needed as a competitive necessity? In other words, do we need this to maintain our competitive position? This certainly might be the case of some projects. Is it a line extension? Is the project being developed to create new services and products? This might be a possibility for why we might want to push a project up higher on the list rather than just looking at the financial aspects of it. The comparative benefit model is another approach in terms of coming up with a qualitative reasoning for selecting a project. The projects are compared in a table of benefits or simply compared pairwise. When we're talking about quantitative project selection, the quantitative models are certainly more popular to evaluate and select projects. Qualitative models are easier to use, but quantitative models are easier to defend. There are two categories of quantitative modeling. That's profitability and scoring. Scoring tends to take into account some of the softer issues. And in fact, this is where we can pull in our qualitative measures into a scoring model. In any case, most quantitative models use profitability, though, as the criterion of acceptability, such as the return on investment or the net present value. But what we're going to use with the roadmap process is what we call a project value index. The opportunity phase itself employs the DRIVE Project Value Index, or PVI, to rank projects for selection. The Project Value Index accounts for quantitative and qualitative returns. Also, the PVI accounts for management time as the primary constraint on projects. The PVI was developed in response to the comment, "We don't have time for our current projects, let alone taking on more," which I heard over and over and over again going into companies in terms of trying to discuss strategic planning and improving the management capability of the organization. The reply is simple. With DRIVE, you can yield greater returns using the same or less management hours currently spent on projects. Let's look at estimating the project value index, or PVI, for a given project. Let's call it Project A for a hypothetical project. Well, we have certain inputs we need to be able to have to go into the PVI calculation. The first would be your financial return. In this case, let's call this $25,000. This would be, of course, estimated with a software package or using an Excel spreadsheet or some other method, but you've got to come up with essentially what you expect the financial return to be. We also need to include the management hours, some estimate of that. And for Project A, we're estimating these at 290 hours. We also need to come up with a value for the qualitative return. And in this case, we've come up with 0.3 or 30%. In the same way as the financial return had to be some sort of external analysis using maybe a spreadsheet, the value for the qualitative return, which would range from 0 to 1.0, also needs to be calculated using some sort of analysis on the outside. Then we need to give a weight for our financial weight and then our qualitative weight. The sum of these should equal to 1.0. We're going to give a weighting of 70% to our financial weight and then a weighting of 30% to our qualitative weight. So now we have all of our inputs. Let's do some calculations. The return to hours ratio is the financial return divided by management hours. So we have 25,000 divided by 290 hours will give us $86 per hour. We need this $86 per hour to calculate the return per hours index, which is essentially the return divided by the number of hours. So the RH essentially is the return per hours ratio, divided by the maximum of all of the other projects under consideration in terms of that project's return. So I'm not showing you this particular project, but it gives a return of $400 per hour. So 86 divided by 400 gives us a ratio of 0.22 for the RHI. This allows us then to calculate the project value, but not the project value index yet. The PV, or project value, is the value in this case for Project A. And what we're doing is we're taking our financial weight and multiplying it by the return per hours index, and then adding that to our quantitative weight times the qualitative return that we believe we're going to get for this particular project. So that gives us 0.7 times 0.22, the product of that, plus 0.3 times 0.3, and the summation of these two products is 0.24. Now we can actually calculate our project value index. Since we have a PV value calculated for all of the different projects we're considering, we can determine which PV value is the maximum value, and that'll be our denominator in this particular calculation. So we take the project value for, in this case, project A, and we divide that by the project value for the maximum value that was calculated amongst all the projects under consideration. In this case, it was 0.76. So 0.24 divided by 0.76 will give you 0.32 or 32%. Now we can use the PVI to actually rank the projects. And here you can see on the far right hand side is a calculation where we've got the PVI and we have indeed ranked the projects based upon it. Just ironically, I guess partly because we gave such a high weighting to the financial return, we have ranked the projects exactly as the financial return is also given. Okay, so the opportunity phase, as I mentioned, was the longest phase, or is the longest phase in the roadmap process in terms of the amount of time. In fact, I was estimating that it takes about 60% of the time of the entire roadmap process to execute the opportunity phase. The next phase after this is the agree phase. And in fact, the remaining phases will not take very much time to discuss. Now in the agree phase, an agreement report is generated which lists projects that were set up in the opportunity phase by their project value index rank. And in fact, we can see to the right how these different projects are listed based upon PVI from high to low. The projects in the agreement report are either accepted or rejected by representatives of the organizations. So in the view that we see here to the right, it's sorted by Division C's 100% capability scores. So in this case, Division C just wants to look and see who's been approving and rejecting essentially the project. It's ranked by PVI, and we can see here in the first row for Project CRM that Division B has already rejected this particular project. That means they're done. If a yellow is given for the project rejection, or not acceptance rather, that means that the company or the organization is still willing to discuss the project and perhaps change that to a green to agree. So we can see the color coding here can once again help us out to quickly identify which projects are going to move forward and which projects are not. So then we move from agree to the develop phase, and in this phase, project proposals that have been set up in charters are now loaded into a project portfolio management system. Manual systems such as using spreadsheets or crib sheets quickly become inefficient and require excessive levels of management time, and as a result, we really feel like the money is better spent on an actual software-based system. So the easiest way to understand project portfolio management is to think of it as a traditional project management system. Except in the case of a PPM, there are no activities, only projects. In other words, the following is true. Projects in the PPM view are essentially the same thing as activities in the project management view. And in fact, as the background to this particular slide, we can see what are examples of projects which are actually linked together. These could be activities depending upon how you really want to define it. I mean, all the projects within an organization can be called activities, and you could say all we're doing is one project every year. That'd be kind of ridiculous, and that's part of why we break things down the way we do, to be able to have workable sets of activities and so forth within each project. In any case, so we can utilize the project view utilizing even the existing software such as project management software. So if you have even within an organization have a standard system like Microsoft Projects, you could actually do project portfolio management with that even. So how are we going to house all these projects that are being developed, collaborative projects, I should state? There's a chance that you'll end up having hundreds of project possibilities between different organizations. So the first choice is that you could, with an enterprise roadmap, certainly have the collaborative roadmaps be electronically linked to projects in the proprietary systems of each organization. However, if your divisions really want to keep their autonomy a little bit more and feel that the proprietary systems should not be electronically linked, then you'll need some sort of centralized location to temporarily house the projects so the roadmaps can be jointly developed and perhaps even run. Linkages to the PPM systems of the participating organizations can be modeled through this, but they're manually managed using what we call, and have you already mentioned, placeholder milestones. And these placeholder milestones work as an alternative that is really clean, simple, and protects proprietary systems and data. The milestone phase has two types of milestones. Program management milestones, and these identify significant completion points in the roadmaps for groups of projects. These are also called collaborative milestones in the collaborative roadmap. The second type of milestone is the roadmap placeholder milestone, which we've already discussed. In the authorized phase, final authorization by upper management of the networked enterprise roadmap occurs at this point. And up to this point, the enterprise roadmap has not been authorized by upper management. And the phases leading to the authorized phase, they should have been monitored and essentially tacitly approved by upper management of each organization. This is in contrast to explicitly approved. However, some explicit approval also did have to occur through acceptance of the outputs of the processes and phases. In the proceed phase, organizations have the option to load projects from the roadmap into their organization's information technology system. And projects in the roadmap now are essentially finally or formally approved, and the roadmap is ready to proceed. Well, this brings us to the concluding remarks for the roadmap process. The roadmap process enables strategic planners to create an enterprise roadmap. By identifying opportunities to maximize an enterprise's capability strengths, the enterprise can leverage its own knowledge and expertise to extend to the enterprise frontier. However, extension to the enterprise frontier may be insufficient to sustain competitive advantage as organizations around the world learn to better leverage their own enterprises. The only way that we can assure sustainable competitive advantage is to not only embrace the enterprise, but also to go one step further and embrace our alliances. And of course, what I'm leading to is the Alliance Roadmap, which is the next chapter of the book Roadmaps to World Class, and covers essentially the idea of the robust process.